And GMP is a framework that's used to manufacture pharmaceutical products. So very tight thresholds for variance. Your THC levels have to be extremely tight, reproducible. You need to demonstrate much tighter production quality control. And it takes an investment to take a facility that's growing and producing cannabis products under GPP and convert it to a GMP facility. And that shift of focus takes you from the current recreational medical market into the pharmaceutical market. And that's the major difference.
Welcome to High5 with Dr. Igor Grant, Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Director of the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego. Each episode will take you on a fascinating journey into the evolving world of medicinal cannabis, as Dr. Grant poses 5 thought-provoking questions to his guests, uncovering their personal journey and unique contributions to the field. Now, here's your host, Dr. Igor Grant.
Today, I'm pleased to welcome as my guest Dr. Mark Ware. Dr. Ware is a pain physician and clinical scientist and is director of the Allen Edwards Pain Management Unit at McGill University Health Center, where he's also an associate professor of family medicine at McGill University. Dr. Ware has advised the Canadian federal government on cannabis policy since 2001, and in 2016, he served as the vice chair of the Federal Task Force on the Legalization and Regulation of Cannabis in Canada. The task force's report became Canadian law as the Cannabis Act in October 2018. Among other topics, we're going to ask Dr. Ware about what the U.S. can learn from Canada's experience. Welcome, Dr. Ware.
Thank you, Igor. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Pleasure is mine. Well, to start, tell us a little bit how you became interested in medicinal cannabis and some of the early work that you did.
Sure. So it really became an interest of mine as a result of patients coming into the pain clinic. Back in the early 2000s, I was seeing chronic pain patients come struggling with their pain. And we had a number of them who self-reported that when they used cannabis, it helped their pain, and they reported, quite remarkable effects. And my initial kind of dive into what did the literature show revealed the existence of an endocannabinoid system, which pointed to the potential analgesic effects of cannabinoids, but a very, very little clinical evidence to support this. So it was kind of putting those two things together that sort of introduced me to the idea that perhaps there was a role for cannabinoids in pain. What I didn't fully realize at that time was the Alice in Wonderland-like rabbit hole that one goes down when you start to explore this. You recognize that, this is an interesting question, but 30 years later, I think there's still an incredible amount to learn, that we scratched the surface with some early clinical trials and safety studies, but it's such a complex topic, such a complex plant, the variety of compounds, the variety of effects, that really we were really just scratching the surface. And our early studies, Igor, were essentially proof of concept pilot studies that were just trying to see, could we do studies with inhaled cannabis in a controlled clinical trial? Could we have placebos? Could we demonstrate effect sizes that could then be used to inform bigger trials? So was really early exploratory work, but even getting those studies done, recognizing the legal, ethical, regulatory barriers, it was years and years of work just to get small studies done, as I'm sure you and your team appreciate. This was really a lot of the energy spent. So proof of concept efficacy. And then we did some large scale safety studies. We basically tracked patients using cannabis over long periods of time to see what sort of safety issues we might have to think about. So we were looking at both efficacy and safety in as best a way as we could.
Right. And were you reaching some conclusions from those studies at the time before we go on to the Cannabis Act itself?
Yeah. I think one of the first things that we recognized was that patients reported to us that they were using cannabis not just for a pain relieving effect. And the classic story that I hear over and over again is patients telling us that when they use cannabis for pain control, it doesn't take the pain away, but somehow it makes the pain feel different, or takes them away from the pain. And this idea that cannabis could affect more than just a pain intensity signal that it had effects on mood, it had effects on sleep, were reported by patients. And we were able to validate that in some of our early clinical trials, that the effects that we saw were not just pain intensity, it was on sleep quality and mood. So this idea that cannabis had this broad spectrum of effects and validated the patient experience was some of our first conclusions. The effect sizes were reasonable. They were certainly comparable to what we were seeing with other pharmacotherapies. But of course, the challenge was then turning those early pilots into large-scale confirmatory trials, which to this day, I'm afraid to say, still remain wanting.
Right. Well, one thing you do mention is that pain is a complex phenomenon and that it is an experience. And what I'm getting to is sometimes people say, well, can we get rid of the psychoactive or psychotropic effects of cannabis and just focus on the pain? But maybe that's wrong-headed in a way, because one needs to manage all of the aspects of the pain experience.
Yeah, I remember those conversations sort of in the mid-2000s and early 2000s when it was kind of the classic line was, well, we want to have cannabinoids, but without the central unwanted side effects. And talking to patients, they didn't feel that the central side effects were that unwanted. They felt a little better. I had one patient's wife, I turned to her and said, well, how is your partner when he uses cannabis? And she said, well, he laughs a lot more than he usually does. And I thought, is that an unwanted side effect, or is that actually somebody feeling a little bit better and happier? I mean, is this not something that we want our patients to do? Now, I get that the issue probably is more around cognitive effects, but the idea of having a slightly mood altering and mood enhancing effect didn't strike me as something necessarily unwanted. And I think now, reflecting back on this, Igor, and especially watching the psychedelic movement now emerging and recognizing how important some of this reshaping of our thoughts about pain and depression and so on, I wonder if we didn't underestimate that central psychoactive effect. Cannabis, as people know, is a powerful psychoactive drug, especially THC-rich cannabis products. And perhaps we treated cannabis too much like an anti-inflammatory, like a pure painkiller. Like it just, you're going to take this and reduce your pain. In fact, the effects of cannabis are so widespread and so altering that maybe we should have been focusing more on some of that psychoactivity as a way to reframe pain, as a way for patients to reimagine, reinterpret their pain. And it's a way in or a means to an end rather than the end itself. I think there's still a lot of work to do enhancing and building on that psychoactivity rather than trying to ignore it.
Right. Well, maybe let's shift to the Cannabis Act. What is it?
The Act is essentially a standalone piece of legislation that the federal government put in place in 2018 on October 17th, which was essentially developed to allow for the legalization and regulation of cannabis products. Canada had, leading up to that time, hemp regulatory frameworks from the early 90s to allow industrial hemp. In the early 2000s, they developed some medical cannabis regulations, which allowed patients who were otherwise prohibited from possessing cannabis to be able to use it as a part of their therapy if they had a medical doctor who would authorize their possession. And essentially, those regulatory frameworks simply removed the legal prohibition on possessing the drug. And of course, as the medical framework evolves over the 2010s, it became clear that all we were essentially doing was providing a rather difficult way for patients to have legal possession. The medical community didn't like this because they were being asked to essentially sign off on a legal possession of authorization. And so coupled with the need for a better approach to cannabis regulation, the federal government put this legislation in place. And essentially it had, aims which were not really about medical use. It was as a non-medical framework, but it allowed and incorporated both the hemp regulations and the medical regulations in this one standalone piece. And a lot of the discussion that we had at the time was, should we just bundle this into, alcohol regs, or should this be part of a food and drug regulatory framework? And it was clear that cannabis was so unique that it deserved its own act. And the Cannabis Act, which actually started out, one of the things I'm most proud of having done is it began as the Marijuana Act. And so the first few months of the discussions, it was like a 12 Angry Men situation where I sort of say, can we not call it marijuana? Can we really call it its scientific name? And gradually it became the Cannabis Act and named that. So it was really intended to capture the regulation of all aspects of cannabis possession, from hemp to medical to non-medical, and to cover the cultivation, production, development of cannabis products. And it's evolved over time, of course, as the regulatory framework has learned from itself. But it really was quite a fascinating. We were the second country in the world after Uruguay to create such a legal framework. Everything from seed to sale was covered under the regulatory framework.
Thank you. That's a great overview. Just a little bit more specific. So under the Act, can physicians prescribe cannabis, or how does that work?
No, I think it's an interesting question, because we often hear physicians talking about prescribing cannabis in Canada. And in fact, under the Act, it's not a prescription, because it still isn't an approved cannabis in its herbal form and in the form that most people consider, the gummies or drinks or foods. These are not prescription drugs. They haven't been approved by the regulatory framework that governs pharmaceutical products. So it's not possible to prescribe cannabis in that way. We do have prescription cannabinoids like nabiximols and nadolone, but the herbal product itself is not a prescription drug. So what physicians do in Canada, and continue to this day under the medical regulations, is to continue to authorize the possession, which, if you think about it now, is not really meaningful, because the idea initially was to protect you from prosecution if you possessed cannabis. So you had an authorization saying, no, I'm allowed to possess this. Here's my authorization. I'm allowed to walk around with cannabis in my pocket. Now that it's legal for adults 18 and over, depending on where you live, but for adults in Canada, it's legal. You can go out, there's shops right around the corner for me. I can go and buy it, and I know what I'm buying. I don't need an authorization to possess cannabis anymore. So there's a lot of question about whether, in fact, this medical framework is still necessary, because it is not a prescription. It is an authorization to possess. And that now is, of course, being questioned.
Canada has a universal health plan, I know. Is it covered? Is cannabis covered under that?
No, it's not. It's certainly not covered under most provincial drug frameworks. There are a few insurance companies, private companies, that will cover it under certain conditions. There are a number of workplace compensation cases that have come through the courts where patients have claimed that cannabis use has helped with certain aspects of their condition. And so that, dealing with workplace safety, dealing with prohibitions on testing positive for cannabis, these have all been addressed. So some workplace compensation boards have allowed for some authorization for patients with the right framework to be able to possess. But by and large, no, it's not a covered expense. You can claim medical cannabis purchases on your taxes at the end of the year, but that's about as far as it goes.
Okay. So just wrapping up the kind of doctor-patient piece of this. So if I were a pain patient, came to you, and through your evaluation, you decided that cannabis might be appropriate to try, what would be the conversation and instruction you would give?
So in the course of the past few years, we've tried to formalize that conversation and figure out a way, because in the absence of strong clinical trial evidence, it's obviously difficult to recommend a dose and a framework, because we don't have the high quality data that we need. So what we've tried to do is develop consensus. There are a large number of very good clinicians who've been working, including in California, and we worked with a number of them in the course of this work, was to say, well, in these cannabis clinics, in centers where people do authorize or recommend cannabis for patients with pain, what's typically done? The framework right now is typically to avoid smoked product or inhaled product for the most part, because chronic pain, particularly where in the domain I work, you're not really dealing with an acute rapid onset product. You don't need a quick onset. You want something that's going to be low and slow and steadily control pain over long periods of time. That's how most of the drugs that we use work. So oral products are recommended, usually oils, cannabis oils. And of course, then we try to start with the less psychoactive products, so CBD predominant oils to begin with. And a number of patients report that helps with their pain, and they can just hold on to relatively low doses of CBD. If those don't work, then you can switch to sort of a starting dose of 2.5 milligrams of THC in an oral capsule 2 or 3 times a day. increase that up to a tolerable level or to the point where they receive an intolerable side effects and they don't like it or it doesn't work. We also have, as I mentioned earlier, prescription cannabinoids. So we have conversations about patients who are, well, maybe we should try one of the prescription products first because you can get that in the pharmacy. It's tightly regulated. So we have, balanced conversations with patients about how they'd like to choose this. But that's typically how it goes. And of course, these are not first-line therapies. The cannabis we introduce only when we've really considered and tried most of the conventional approaches, and those haven't worked, which is unfortunately for a large number of patients in our tertiary clinic. Then we have open conversations, and it's surprising how many patients have actually on their own tried it. So, the first question is, well, have you ever tried cannabis for your pain? And if they say, well, yes, I have, and, it surprisingly helped me sleep. So we say, okay, well, maybe we can work with that. Maybe this is something we can incorporate into your treatment plan using a quality control product.
Well, just if we could move on a little bit, since the passage of the Act, you said it was in 2018, what have we learned from that experience? What's the good, the bad, and the ugly of it?
Well, I guess the big takeaway is that, the sky didn't fall in. Canada didn't fall apart. We didn't have epidemics of road traffic accidents. We didn't have epidemics of psychotic episodes in the hospitals. We didn't have massive school dropouts. We didn't see huge surges in cannabis use among youth. I remember in 2020 when they looked back at, what are the major health issues of 2019? And I thought, okay, here we go, legalizing cannabis. Was this one of the big health stories of 20? It didn't even appear on the radar. Like it just kind of happened, and there was a lot of excitement about the industry and the stock market and investment. As a health product, it kind of just rolled out, and I think ultimately what happened was people that were using it already basically switched to the legal system, and we've seen that over time. Now around about 70 to 80% of the people who were using it from the illicit market have now transitioned to purchasing their cannabis from the licit market. And essentially, it really hasn't been a big health story. We've learned a lot about, the risks of packaging issues and making sure that packaging is properly done so children don't inadvertently use cannabis that's lying around, especially gummies and chocolates and products that are appealing to them. We've learned a lot about the risks there, and that's typically in the illicit side. We've learned, more and more about hyperemesis and cannabis-induced hyperemesis, is that we've seen cases of that in the clinic, in the ERs, and we know, some of these safety signals, but you've now got a legal product being used on a massive scale. You're going to see some of these rare, unpleasant and unwanted things. So we've learned a lot about those, and maybe now we're learning how to use cannabis more responsibly. But by and large, it has been a relatively smooth transition. The industry, of course, will argue differently. They've struggled to make this work, but the provincial governments that control the monopoly on sales of cannabis have done very well over the last 5 years. There are cannabis stores that are in Quebec that are government run. Some provinces where they had private company or private businesses that were allowed to sell cannabis, they've struggled because they were just popping up like mushrooms everywhere. And then so obviously the market is settling down and we're realizing what the real demand is. But apart from the economics of cannabis, the health side, it's been a relatively non-event. It's now just available legally. It's part of the social fabric of Canada.
So you're saying we don't have a bunch of Canadians just being high all the time and stumbling into each other or running into each other if they're driving vehicles?
Well, no more than we did before legalization. Let me put it that way. So there's definitely Canadians stumbling around high as kites on a Friday night in Montreal, but it has not surged in popularity. It's just that they can now know what they're buying. And in fact, I think the consumer, by and large, has become a lot more educated. They can now walk into a shop and they know what THC percentages they're looking for. We're seeing patterns of sales and we're beginning to understand the behavior of the consumer. So it's allowing us to get a much better idea of what cannabis consumption really looks like, which of course, because it was illegal prior to that, it was kind of hidden away and nobody really fully understood what people use, how they use it, what they prefer. So it's been a fascinating experience in seeing how legal cannabis is actually playing out in real world use.
You mentioned provincial experience. For our American listeners, provinces are like states, kind of. And Is the kind of implementation of the Cannabis Act different in different provinces and territories?
It is. So
Stage of
this was,
use
again,
or
part of the
whatever it may be.
yeah, part of the process of developing the framework for the Cannabis Act was recognizing what is federal regulatory framework areas and what belongs to the provinces, and then what belongs to the municipality. So the arena where you have your stores, how far they are from schools. So there's a tremendous layering of responsibility. The federal government, crudely speaking, it controls the cultivation and legal framework of possession and what's allowed from the commercial side. The sales and distribution of cannabis products is much more of a provincial jurisdiction. And then, of course, the retailing is more municipal. So multiple layers of government have to be involved from the provinces and territories. So in some ways, there is a patchwork. And in fact, it's kind of an interesting natural experiment because we're seeing some provinces set higher age limits. So in Quebec, for instance, 21 years and older is the access point, whereas in Ontario, right across the border, it's 18 and over. So, the differences in patterns of use and differences in adoption and the rates of in uptake of illicit cannabis production and use varies. Quebec doesn't allow vaporized cannabis oils, doesn't allow certain types of edibles, whereas Ontario does. So you've got these kind of natural differences based on provincial variation that's been now that we're getting large scale data that's actually been used to see whether these different levers of policy can affect consumption patterns and ultimately consumer safety. So it's been very interesting.
Good. Turning to sort of medical research specifically, has the Cannabis Act helped medical research?
This is where I sort of take a deep breath. And unfortunately, this has not been as big an output of the act as I think a lot of us that worked in the medical and scientific community hoped it would be. And this is a complex area to dive into because, why is that? So the reason for the Cannabis Act's primary incentives were, to protect youth from illicit cannabis, to reduce the size of the black market. And it wasn't about developing a medical framework. They basically left the medical framework untouched and said, well, we're just going to leave that there and we'll revisit it in 5 years' time. And that's still underway. There wasn't a lot of money put into clinical research for medical purposes. A lot of it went into public health and risk and safety concerns for public use and non-medical use. And of course, it was, I think, hoped that the industry would step in and pick up on this legal framework and say, okay, well, now that we can produce cannabis products legally and produce extracts and produce oils and tinctures, potentially the industry would pick up, as the pharmaceutical companies do, is they're really driving the research. And for a number of reasons, the industry didn't pick up on that in this sense. And I was, full disclosure, I was at Canopy Growth, one of the larger producers, over 2018 to 2022, and we tried to build up a big clinical trial framework. The problem, of course, was that we couldn't create the type of products that met the pharmaceutical standard that would then be authorized or regulated into clinical trials. What's regulated in Canada for consumption by non-medical users is not regulated to the quality level that a pharmaceutical product is. So companies had to retool their entire production facilities to create GMP products to be able to use these as reliable and pharmaceutical grade products. And the cost involved were prohibitive. Some of the regulatory frameworks were very challenging, as that, we had to jump through multiple hoops to allow the products to be used in clinical trials. And the companies, honestly, were more interested in chasing the recreational market, which was booming. Of course, at that time, they were really exploring that. And it was a fewer barriers and much easier pathway. So the pattern shifted away from the medical research side. And I think it's beginning to pick up now. I'm beginning to hear companies that are starting to work on quality control cannabis products that really do meet pharmaceutical standards, but it didn't have the boom in clinical trial research that I think a lot of us had hoped for.
If I understand it, so there are kind of two different standards. So there are standards for manufacture of cannabis or consumption, right? Including medical consumption by the person. That's right. And that's a different standard than what you're talking about, which is more like the American FDA standard. Right.
Yeah, probably true. And I know my regulatory colleagues will shudder at the simplicity that I'm putting this, but effectively, the cannabis products that are purchased now by medical patients under the authorization framework from companies or for the recreational market are produced under what's called good production practices, GPP, which is a regulatory state framework that allows for cultivation. It's known, it's tested, it's measured, but it doesn't have the same level of tightness of control as something which would be under good manufacturing practice. And GMP is a framework that's used to manufacture pharmaceutical products. So very tight thresholds for variance. Your THC levels have to be extremely tight, reproducible. You need to demonstrate that much tighter production quality control. And it takes an investment to take a facility that's growing and producing cannabis products under GPP and convert it to a GMP facility. And that shift of focus takes you from the current recreational medical market into the pharmaceutical market. And that's the major difference.
Is there, I don't mean to get, pardon the pun, too deep in the weeds here, but but is there what might be a difference between the GPP and GMP? Is there something you could point to? Is it more how pure the product is, for example, or is it something about how it's manufactured? Or
yeah, I'm going to preface these remarks by saying I'm not, a regulatory expert. I don't want to sound like I'm giving the true story here, but I think something like the margins of error in the product itself. So let's take a recreational THC containing flower. It's allowed to be sold with a certain label, but it's allowed a variance, plus or minus 5% of THC, above or below the labeled amount. In a pharmaceutical product, it's much tighter, more like 1% or less than 1%. You cannot have a pharmaceutical product that you imagine if you're going and picking up your prescription insulin and it was, 10% off what it said it was, that could have massive effects on the patient's dosing and effects and safety. GMP really tightens that up. And there are other, control standards in the facility, the way it's labeled, the way you test the processes going through the production framework, all of that has to be really carefully. So if something happens, you have a recorded pathway of where the product came from and who touched it and when. So it's a much more industrial, much more quality controlled process than GPP. Crudely speaking, I think that's probably one way of looking at it, and the documentation in order to make a pharmaceutical product.
Right. Good. Well, thank you, because I'm not sure that we have that distinction in the U.S., and that's interesting. Well, just to wrap it up, I'll put you really on the spot. What if you were the King of America? What would you do based on this experience?
Do you have a King of America already? No, let's leave that one hanging.
Yes, seriously, is there?
Yeah.
Because as you know, the U.S. has this very fractured system where more than half the population lives in states where cannabis is either frankly legal or at least medically legal. And then at the federal level, it's treated like heroin. So what do you think might be a good way to go?
Well, I think what I celebrate that Canada did was it allowed a federal top-down regulatory legal framework, which then gave provinces, the population, a sense that this was, regulated in a way that there was some comfort, some trust in what they were buying. And I think what I worry about in the US is that lack of federal oversight or engagement means that there's an enormous sort of tapestry of different approaches, things like, what you can possess, what testing for the products, what kinds of products you can make, the kinds of what's legal, these synthetic cannabinoids, the minor cannabinoids. There's this sort of explosion of interest. But without that sort of oversight from a regulatory framework, without the ability to do proper banking, without the ability to control and measure side effects and adverse event reporting, you leave it into this patchwork of a regulatory work. Now, in the Cannabis Act, it's important to say that we actually did visit Colorado, Washington State, and learned a lot from what they had done there in terms of setting up the regs. And we asked them the same questions. What would you do differently if you could do this all over again? So I think it's really an interesting time now that if, the US is looking at this pathway to reach back to Canada and say, okay, what would you do differently? What levers would you adjust? What would you do differently? And so I think there's a lot of shared lessons there. But I think that the lack of federal engagement, I think, is one of the major issues that keeps this sort of bubbling along in this simmering state where it's kind of not one thing nor the other. And there's always that risk that things suddenly change and somebody decides to change their mind and impose federal law across the states. I think that holds everything back. But a federal strong policy that would allow for some development innovation would be a game changer.
Canada is a different country, but it's probably a lot more similar to the U.S. than most other countries, like Holland, for example, or Uruguay. So there's things we can learn. I guess part of my thought is, can we open this window up? And, you're reassuring, for example, that, not everybody's going around stoned and, as I say, running into each other in their automobiles, because that tends to be the scare tactic that you mentioned. For example, hyperemesis. New York Times ran a huge, very long piece on hyperemesis. I mean, what pages long? Yeah. Made it sound like here's this horrible thing that needs to cause us to rethink everything about cannabis. Well, it is a real thing, as you said. It happens. It's rare.
But it's not the story.
And it's usually with people who use tons of marijuana for a long time. But there tends to be this black and white thinking south of our border that I'm hoping we can correct somehow.
Yeah, well, we're emerging from and even in Canada, it was the same story developing the act, was that the paradigm of prohibition, which was where we were before, kind of had driven the narrative so powerfully that, it was all about protection and safety and risk. And this idea as clinicians, we're like, well, maybe there's a value to this. Maybe we can use this drug in a positive, helpful way, was really shaking that paradigm. And I think it still continues to come up against this idea that cannabis and drugs are bad. There's this sort of moral prohibition as well. And I think that's slowly changing. But I think the main issue for us in Canada was that legalizing and regulating it didn't increase use among youth, didn't increase these major public health fears. And so they were very closely monitored. So I think that story of the prohibition framework driving the narrative is slowly changing, but it's a generational shift. It's so deep seated in thinking that you and I will be long retired and done by the time things start to, change that level. But it's happening and we're in the middle of it.
Well, excellent. Mark, this has been wonderful to talk with you. You have been one of the certainly thought leaders in this field and influenced what I would call a rational equipoise on an issue for which there isn't just one correct answer. And I think Canadians have managed to strike, as I say, a kind of equipoise on this. It's not perfect, but nothing in human life is.
No. Well, thank you, Igor. Thanks for the kind words. Thanks for your leadership. It's always a pleasure to speak, and we go a long way back. So thank you for inviting me on the podcast and keeping the conversation going. This isn't going away. It's clearly a topic of great interest, scientifically, legally, many, many aspects of it. So I'm delighted to see the conversation continue, and thanks for stimulating it.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Mark Ware, McGill University. We're talking about what can we learn from Canada's experience with the Cannabis Act.
If you liked this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. For more information on the Center for Medicinal Cannabis Research at UC San Diego, please find us on social media at CMCR_UCSD on Twitter or X, Instagram, and other social media platforms. Or visit our website at cmcr.ucsd.edu. Thanks for listening.